talk about the loss of agricultural land. This is an exceptionally complex issue, and I'm not going to do it justice, but I want to talk about the interface between the amount of agricultural land we have in Alberta and an issue that's going on, maybe insidious to many, I think profound, needs to be understood, and its implications to Alberta in terms of food security down the road. So if you didn't know anything about Alberta and you just started pulling out graphs, crop production through time, looks pretty good. We're growing up. Look at individual crop types, production is going up. Clearly, we have a healthy agricultural sector. If you looked at the amount of land that's under irrigation, it's going up. Another good sign of growth. It's generating more revenue. Healthy yet again. Some of that must be tied to agricultural land. So let's take Alberta back for 100 years and figure out how it got to where it is. So we'll start in 1910, and those grids of multiple townships show you the arrival of the first cultivated land in Alberta. 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. You can see Peace River's well established now, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to today. And you see that in recent decades it's been asymptotic. It's basically beginning to level off. The redder the colors, the greater the percentage of the grid that is cultivated. That's how we got to the cultivated lands we have today. It's about 22% of Alberta. It's what, about 12 million hectares, give or take what we want to do with improved grasslands. It grows a lot of crops, historically mainly for export. Concomitant with crop production has been our cattle growth. So there's 1910, 20s, 30s, 40s, some interannual or interdecadal variation, but the general pattern is one of growth up until recently. So again, 3 million head of humans, or about 4 million head of humans today, 6 million head of cows. And a really interesting dynamic between how we grow forages and how we grow our livestock. If we're going to understand, I think, the future of agriculture and part of the complexity between the fuel stocks that drive it and the consumerism, we need to understand that Alberta is not only agriculture. And if we look at our system, as many people have alluded to today, we're highly effective at bringing in risk capital. We're struggling to have enough boys and girls to do work, so we import them either domestically or internationally. We draw down on natural resources, water, air, land, hydrocarbons, soil organics, and we produce commodities. And the bulk of our commodities in this province during the period of time that you folks have all been alive have been for export. Not entirely, but primarily. So there's obviously other things going on than just producing forage and livestock. And in fact, and I won't read these numbers, but these numbers reasonably well reflect the average productivity of the province of Alberta over the last several years on each of these key commodities. And one of the things we need to remind ourselves is that you could not find any other geography of comparable size to the province of Alberta that's producing that total amount of caloric output. We have a superheated economy. All those commodities require footprint, and many of that footprint is on agricultural land. Historically, by far the biggest footprint we've ever put that is anthropogenic in the province of Alberta is out of agriculture. But now agriculture is being eaten into, and that's what I wanted to talk to today. So to understand agriculture, and you can imagine your kids and grandkids sitting at an AIA conference like this in 40, 50 years, they will come to appreciate the effective cumulative consequences of overlapping land use practices on a province that isn't changed by 1 square centimeter in size, but is rapidly changing in composition. Forestry, energy, agriculture, transportation, residential, all unfolding. Many of them unfolding at an exponential rate. So in this particular map, going back to when Alberta first became a province, I'm going to strip off all cropland, because if you put it on, you can't see the other things that are going on. And I want people to understand that other stuff is going on. And these cells, which are quarter township, are expressed as anthropogenic footprint in percent. So going from none to very high, high being red. And you can see the early roads coming in 1910, 1920, 1930s. So you're seeing roads, you're seeing where people live. Not showing any crops here. 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, to where we are today. Some of this footprint overlaps the agricultural sectors of the province of Alberta. Some of them don't. But we need to understand that what's driving our human population is primarily the phenomenal rate of investment associated with the hydrocarbon sector, what, $250 billion today, sitting on the table. And to make that work, we need a lot of people. And the vast majority of those people live in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. So we're going to start talking about that. Now, as all these land uses unfold, including agriculture, there's an unbelievable suite of benefits. But as both of the Andrews talked about in previous talks earlier today, there's also a suite of liabilities. Let's look at biodiversity. And it's only gone one way, and it's almost entirely in the white area, and it's almost entirely associated with agriculture. And so any effort to look at any evenness, diversity indices, if they're increasing in Alberta, it's only because of the arrival of exotic invasives, of non-Indigenous. So it's not going the other way around. We're losing native species. All of our studies show that quite clearly. Soil carbon, does it matter? You bet. Some of it's frozen, and Andrew reminded us that's important. But if we look at it through time, here's we're simulating in the LC's model, we see two landscapes in which soil carbon is being reduced incrementally through time. One is agriculture through a series of crops that have mined incrementally carbon, and the other is in the forest sector where we've shifted the age class structure. We not only have just fire, we have forestry, so we have additive disturbances, changing the demography of forest and changing its amount of carbon. So we all know where all this carbon is gone. It's all atmospheric now, or net anyway. If you look at biotic carbon, water quality, water quantity, and biodiversity and start throwing them together, and notice that this graph doesn't scale to 0, it's basically 1 to 0.75, we begin to see that the province is changing. And then we're losing or drawing down on the ecological bank account. These accounts of natural capital are dropping down. So along with all the benefits are coming these liabilities. All land uses are accountable for this and responsible. Agriculture is one of the dominant ones that is accountable for this, as you can see where the reds are. And that will speak to, I think, as time marches on, public license to operate in the province of Alberta that doesn't apply or with a spotlight only on the classic hydrocarbon sector, but also on agriculture. So let's start zooming in a bit on this dynamic between where people live and agriculture. We have land use because we have people. So let's grow them. 1900, we got about 3.7 million people. How did we get there? Well, I'm going to actually back up. 1930. Many of you in this room were, well, some of you in this room were alive then. Look where the people are. The yellow part of the graph is rural people. Those are farmers. Basically, 70% of all Albertans lived on farms in 1930. 30% lived in cities. Now watch what happens when we move forward through time and grow our population and get to see its distribution. We're now at over 80% people living in cities and 20% living in the country. And the 20% of living in the country, of that 20, 6% live on farms and 14% are acreage people. I wonder how many homes there are in rural residential. I wonder what kind of lands they've been built on. Let's just look at just rural residential. Obviously, it's grown through time. I just said 20% of all Albertans live outside of cities. Notice in the 1930s, most people were living in southern Alberta and living in southeastern Alberta. Watch how that dynamic shifts as we move from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s to today, where it's primarily in the western portion of the white area, in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, where people are living the dream, driven by a hydrocarbon sector, not wanting to live in a city for that 20%, but be close enough to be able to drive in for amenities or for work. But it's really clear that it's in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. And we know, why do those populations start there to begin with, if we go all the way back to the various early ones? People looking for the intersection between good soils and available water. And that's, of course, where we started farming, too. So in 2005, we had 3.6 million people. Conservatively, by 2055, we will have 7.5. That means that there will be about 3.9 million additional Albertans by 2055. And 3 out of 4 of them are going to live in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. So let's take a look at the biggest hamlet in Alberta. That's Calgary. 1951, Calgary was 93 square kilometers. 2007, it was 580 square kilometers. If it continues to grow in area, and I don't really pretend to know exactly the shape, but we'll use just Euclidean math to grow it in some reasonable way and let it grow into the Susina Reserve, it's going to be 3,000 square kilometers. So what was being consumed between this yellow and that red and that red? Primarily agricultural soils, but that's just got to be the exception to the rule. It can't be generic, right? And then Edmontonians would be pleased to remind Calgarians that they don't really have any good soils. And these are where our good black soils are, right? So there's Edmonton, and just south of it, Wernerville, or some of the best soils we've ever had, the deep blacks. Edmonton growing from 75 square kilometers to 433 in 2007 to over 2,000 by 2057. Those are just two examples. I can give you another 20 examples. So interestingly enough, the model shows that one of the key conversations we need to have is actually urban design. We'd use the model to look at forestry and energy and agriculture, and they all have effects. But where people live have profound consequences to many of these land uses, particularly our agricultural soils, because Alberta is the poster child in Canada, Edmonton and Calgary are, of urban sprawl. So we're growing out, we're not growing up. As we grow out, we're consuming good agricultural soils. And as this graphic is intended to show, if we choose to grow out instead of up, we significantly cause loss of agricultural landscapes, which has implications to food security, which I'll show, also has massive implications to carbon dynamics as to whether we choose to build cities where we walk and have public transportation or ones that we choose to drive on. Okay, here's the history of all the settlements, every farmyard, every acreage, every city and town in Alberta. It's 5,000 square kilometers today. That's 1/2 hectares. If we continue with the business as usual growing out versus up, we're doing both at the same time. It's just the ratio is pushed more towards sprawl. We have 9,000 square kilometers that will be transformed in the next 5 decades, the majority of which will be in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. That's 0.9 hectares. Now, I don't know, does that seem like a big number to you? We've got 12 million hectares of cropland, so if we only lose 1/12 of it, maybe it's not a big problem. The problem is the kind of soils it's growing over top, the best of the soils. So 14,000 square kilometers is what the settlement footprint will be by 2055. Of that, not all, but the majority will be in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. And just to remind us why that's happening, if you value that land at $1.5 million per square kilometer, which is not a bad, but maybe a little conservative estimate of its commodity price based on the last several years, that's about $14 billion. So as those farmers have those kind of checks put on their kitchen table, we well understand the dynamic and why that land is sold, which creates another issue. Actually, I'll just illustrate this first. Okay, there's, all of Alberta is underlain by soils. All of our lakes, even the Precambrian Shield, is soils. Some of them are a whole lot better than others, right? That's where people live. Let's put people density distribution and just put a kernel around it, dissolve it off. And we get to see that where people are living, of course, the Edmonton-Calgary corridor and some of our best soils. This year, we'll lose 15,000 hectares of cropland. And that is urban sprawl. That's a transportation network of roads going to cut blocks, roads going to acreages, and other types of utilities, but it's primarily urban sprawl. So one of the consequences of this, if you simulate the total amount of cropland per person, so now we could maybe start using terms like food security. Back in 1905, there was 4 hectares per person. It grew to about 5 hectares per person in the 1960s. That red line at the bottom is 0.8 hectares per person, and for our latitude, that is a reasonable estimate of the amount of agricultural land you need to generate enough calories to keep yourself alive for 365, if in fact we were supporting ourselves, which of course we don't. We export a lot, and we import a lot. We export more than we import. And that's how we see ourselves. But isn't this interesting? we've gone from 5 to 2.3. Basically today we're probably closer to 2.1. And as our human population continues to grow, and it goes into the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, and it consumes our agricultural lands, by 2055 we're at 0.8. What does that mean? It means that we will be talking about Alberta being a net importer of calories for food. So unlike an era we've ever been. Now, I need to say that I'm growing crop rates into the future at the rates we have today. And people would be quick to remind us that that doesn't need to be the case. And in fact, crop rates on a per hectare basis have grown exponentially. And as Andrew Nikiforuk reminded us, that's because of the significant inputs and the significant tie between the hydrocarbon sector and agriculture. If hydrocarbons are unavailable quantitatively or prohibitively expensive on a commodity price side, we may not do that. And even if they are available, society may very well awaken to a recognition that we need to internalize all those things that have been externalized, like water quality. And we might find it progressively more challenging to increase our rates of herbicides, fertilizers. So, just first order math. More people need more food. The amount of land we're growing the food on is going down. And these are all non-climate change scenarios. On the meat production side, as you can see here, we've typically grown more than we demand. So we've had a surplus, and that's why we've been an exporter in terms of meat. As we grow it into the future, and we're growing the amount of land that's available for cattle, and we're looking at the rates at which the cattle population is expected to grow, and not changing any dietary preferences, we get into a similar situation where in the future we could actually become a net importer too. Now, I would not place any strong confidence in which decade that'll happen, but the vectors are there, and I think they deserve to be discussed. Alberta's historically known itself as an exporter. We could make this a little bit more real. We're all sitting in a room that's in the Bow River Basin. So there's the Bow River Basin, and here we're looking at food security. And this shade of green means that the amount of calories this landscape is producing is equal to the demand for it. So this is range of natural variability prior to the arrival of the Europeans, and I'm making the assumption that First Nations people were probably doing an okay job of feeding themselves. But let's grow it to today. Red is where you have a significant deficit. You need a lot more food than you're growing on those individual cells. Yellow, not quite as much, but you're certainly in deficit. And the darker shades of green are the producing areas. And everyone knows that the Bow River is not the breadbasket of Alberta, but it illustrates this point quite well. I thought I'd show it because of where we're located today. That's today. If we grow the human population and use business as usual, this is where this basin itself will be in 70 years. It just reminds us of how much land that was growing crop is now supporting houses and rural residential. We can grow the same population exactly and pull the lever on best management practices and urban design and grow up versus out. And we don't make the problem go away, but we significantly mitigate it. So again, just reminding ourselves about the importance of urban design. Okay, so society's having a broader conversation. Yes, we need to grow food, fuel, fiber, we need our settlements, but the pace of the land use trajectory in Alberta is such that we're also seeing these natural capital bank accounts being drained incrementally, generally at about 2% per year. And we need to change that around. I think everyone today, I was so pleased to heard about the need to internalize externalities. Things like water quality, water quantity, carbon, biodiversity, those are real things. They're commodities. They need to be put on the table. They need to be assessed quantitatively in terms of the benefits and liabilities of any land use. So all of them need to be discussed in a fair, balanced, and quantitative way that's going to create some new discussions, obviously, and they're going to be difficult ones. Hopefully we can get beyond this rhetoric of, somehow we can find the win-win-win where everyone can do everything everywhere all the time. I hope we're beyond that rhetoric. This is about trade-offs. It's about explicit discussion of limits. It's about attending to thresholds. It's about understanding risk. It's about knowledge. I think Andrew Weaver just gave us a great presentation about why those criteria should apply and often don't in policy around organic and inorganic carbon. So this is not a talk that's anti-business, saying that we shouldn't talk about commodity production. GDP is a very important economic metric. We just need to remind ourselves that to produce commodities, you have to draw down on natural capital. There's this interesting dynamic. The society wants us to look at ecological goods and services, and this particularly applies to agriculture, whether it be crop and or livestock. And if you combine them together, you get a metric called true economic performance. And that's what we need to think about. That's what our kids want us to think about. So in that context, we have to think about agriculture. And the speakers this morning did a wonderful job of reminding us that there's some phenomenal constraints. We're going to need new alternative economic instruments. We have to find ways of paying farmers for more than just crops, and ranchers for more than just beef, and loggers for more than wood fiber. Because if we do that, we have the tragedy of the commons, and we just drain these accounts, as Andrew Weaver described. We need to find ways, whether market-based or mandated, that pay landowners for a broader suite of services. And that's one very effective way of leaving carbon in a biotic form. I don't see how we can expect the farmers of Alberta to change their practices meaningfully. Most of them are not doing that well economically without some alternative economic incentives to do so. And I think Albertans are going to waken up as they look at this province that becomes so big, and as these cities begin to expand over agriculture, and you ask, well, what is it we get from agriculture? And they'll be reminded that to grow a cow, you need a lot of area, or cropland a lot of area, for its commodities relative to energy or forestry. Some might talk about employment. How many jobs you get from agriculture compared to energy and forestry? Direct or indirect? It's not a particularly favorable equation. What about royalties? Well, you don't get any from agriculture. So agriculture has a lot of work ahead of it to remind Albertans that it produces food and has a mandate, should have a mandate to produce nutritious food, which is what John Kennelly reminded us of. And it's in the process, it went through an era where it just expanded over all these native grasslands. And now it's in a process of being systematically consumed, particularly the better soils, by other land uses. And are the policies that shape this dynamic ones that are serving us well? You know, someone asked me, I showed this the other day in front of a bunch of lawyers, where I got the numbers from, and I said, well, I just drank a few beers, and when the blood alcohol level was right, I drew this graph. But I don't think it's grossly wrong. There was a time where every person in Alberta was involved in one land use, and that was First Nations. There was a time where all white people in Alberta were involved with the land use of killing bison, of trapping. Forestry and energy sector, forestry and mining came along. Agriculture came along and created a massive benefit and transformed much of this landscape. I'd say in terms of a political leverage, it's not as important today as it used to be. Settlements, where we live, because so many of us are disassociated with the land, is an unbelievably important political instrument. And of course today the hydrocarbon sector is key. So where does agriculture fit in? One of the things you see, things start small and then they get big and then they get small. Well, as long as we have people, we're going to need food. How are we going to grow it? How much of Alberta are we going to allocate for food? How much are we going to protect those good soils in terms of urban sprawl? Someone reminded me the other day that Albertans are so wealthy we don't need to produce any food here. We can just buy it. And you know what? Technically they're right, at least at today's commodity prices. But as Andrew Nikifork reminded us, as those commodities become progressively more scarce and more expensive, this whole system is going to reawaken itself and it'll be transformed. Anyway, really enjoyed the opportunity to come and chat to you and hopefully contribute some thoughts. Thank you.